So just to finish off this section then, the last bit you might think, well, why don't we get rid of the calculation? So what we can do there is hide away the details of the calculation. So this is a function. We've seen functions that we pass information in, we've seen functions we pass information out. This one where we do both, we created this calculate function where we pass in the two numbers that have been input by the user, we pass in the operation that's been input by the user, and then we do the calculation and return that, whatever the combination is, whatever we've calculated. Okay, so that's sort of completes things, and then we have to invoke that function or call that function with this combination equals calculate number one, number two, and the operation. So we pass those three bits of information in, we get one bit of information back, which then gets passed to the output. So that's that bit of code looks like this. We've now got three functions at the top. We've got input int, we've got calculate, we've got output, and the main program is now nice and simple because we've hidden a lot of details away. We've got we ask the user for their first int, we ask them for the second one, we ask them what the operation is, we do the calculation, and then we output the answer. So then the main program now has come down to essentially 5 lines of code with all the details of what happens with those operations hidden away in functions. I'm not saying you'd necessarily do it like this for a simple program like this, but that shows you how you can create a number of functions that will hide away details of code. And if you're doing things repeatedly, where you have to do the same thing over and over again, like this input int, where we're having to do the conversion over and over again, then it's definitely worth creating a function to do that. Okay, let's have a quick check then. So, on which line is calculate invoked? Have a look through it, and okay, if you said line 25, you'd be correct, because invoked is where you, in the main program, where you call a function, where you use the function, where you invoke the function. Okay, it all means the same thing. So it's not up here where it's not line 7 where it's created, defined. It's down here, line 25, where it's called or invoked. People use different words. In fact, I don't hear invoked very often. I think called is more common, but invoked is the technical term. Which line is calculate declared? Okay, well, hopefully you may have said line 7, which would be, that would be fine. Strictly speaking, it's the whole lot, so it's line 7 to 12. So strictly speaking, and you can see actually this editor has put little brackets around it to show, the whole chunk of code that calculate is declaring. How many parameters does it have? Okay, well, hopefully you'll have said 3, because there's number 1, number 2, and operation. That's the information from the function's point of view, the information that's it's being given, number 1, number 2, and operation. And what does it return? Hopefully you'd said combination, but strictly speaking, it doesn't return the variable combination itself. It returns the value stored in the variable, and I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. Okay, so it's actually takes a copy of whatever's stored in that variable combination and returns that. And here's another quick check. On what line of the code does the execution start? Okay, well, can you think about that briefly? Hopefully you said line 19, because as I said previously, all these functions, as Python's reading in this program and running it, it stores up, it understands what the function is, but it doesn't run anything until it gets to line 19, where it then calls this input int function here. So it starts technically on line 19. What order are the statements executed? Well, there's quite a long list here now, as you can imagine, because we've hidden all the details away. So, but I would say, hopefully you'll think about this for a second. Actually, there's no point me pausing. You can pause the video if you want to think about it. The answers are 19, Okay, but then it calls 2, then it runs 2, 3, and 4. Then it does 21, and it does 2, 3, and 4 again, because it's calling the input int and using those lines in there. Then it does 23. Then it does 25, but 25 drops down into the calculate function. So, and that what is which lines are executed here depends on whether the user's typed in plus or minus. So it could be 8 and 9, or it could be 8 and 10 and 11. Then line 12, and then finally it does line 27, but that drops it down into the output function. So then it executes line 16. So you can see that there's no longer this linear sense, but if you think about these if you sort of forget about what the functions are doing, then there's still a linear sense in the main program. So it's 19, 21, 23, 25, 27, but each one of those essentially is dropping down into a function and doing some other statements. Okay, one other thing you can do in Python very easily is pass in a function as a parameter to another function. Okay, this isn't possible in all programming languages, but Python's rather nice in allowing us to do this. So we can pass in a function as a parameter to another function, and that might seem like it's going to be a really complicated thing to do, but here we've got a function called input int, which we pass in we pass in a string, and it then asks the user for some information and then converts whatever the user gives it back to an integer. Actually, we could have a function called input and convert where we tell it what it's going to convert it into. So we could, I'm not saying you would necessarily do this, but we could tell it we want an int back, or we want a Boolean back, or we want a string back. We decide what we want by telling it what the conversion is going to be inside the function. And to do that, we can pass in the conversion function very neatly inside Python. So here's an example. Input and convert. It's like the previous one in the sense that we pass in the prompt, but we also pass in the conversion function, which is, it might be int or it might be something else. And then we prompt the user using the input, the built-in input function. That gives us a string back, and then we convert that. Actually, I shouldn't really call it a number here, should I? I should call it something else, just a value. We convert that string using the conversion function. Okay, so now in our main program, we would have input and convert, the prompt, which is first number, and then int to say we want that converted into an integer. Okay, so this, as I say, I wouldn't necessarily suggest you do it like this, but this is a very generic kind of function because it asks the user for something and then it converts it into whatever we tell it we want. Okay, so we could, in this case, we could use that for the operation here, where we ask it for an operation plus or minus, and we just convert that into a string. It's already a string, so nothing really happens when it gets converted. But it's just a nice way of using Python to make this a very generic function that will allow us to change whatever the user types into anything we want. Okay, I'm going to stop this video here, and then we'll look at some problems, things that can go wrong when you're using functions.